The sky of Aralith was blue no more. Its once soft winds now carried ash, and the smell of scorched metal above the crystal forests. Silver ships tore through the clouds like blades. The peaceful planet, untouched for thousands of years, was now under fire, and at the heart of it all stood Princess Virea, heir to the ancient Alari bloodline. Untouched in both battle and body, Virea had trained in ancient magic, diplomacy, and the art of healing. She had never held a weapon in war, nor had she ever allowed a soul close to her chamber. Her purity was more than a tradition, it was sacred. Among her people, she wore the mark of the first flame on her wrist, a sign of unbroken ancestral lineage, but that mark pulsed now with unease, as if it sensed that change had arrived on fire and thunder. The invaders were not known to the Alari. Their weapons were loud, their tactics brutal, and their numbers endless. They moved unlike any species her scholars had recorded. Her guards said they were Terran's humans from a world lost beyond the charts of the stars. And one of them had been captured alive. The human prisoner was brought before her in chains. He was tall, wounded, and yet his eyes held no fear when he saw Virea. His gaze did not bow or tremble. Instead, it searched her like a puzzle waiting to be solved, and for a moment, she forgot about the war outside. He said his name was Kale, a soldier from a lost human colony that believed Earth no longer existed. His ship had crashed, and he had no part in the invasion. He was not like the others, and yet he shared their blood. Virea should have ordered him locked away or executed, but instead, she asked for his chains to be removed. Her council screamed betrayal. The elders reminded her of the sacred law. No outsider had ever touched a royal, let alone shared breath in her presence. But Virea dismissed them with a voice that felt strangely stronger than before. Something about Kale stirred fire where there had only been frost. He was taken to the inner gardens under watch days past, and she visited often, first out of curiosity, then from a pull she couldn't explain. Kale asked her questions no one had dared. He mocked the endless traditions, praised the stars not for their names but for their beauty. He made her laugh, something her people rarely did without reason, and quote, when she laughed, it was not the laugh of a princess, but of a woman. Kale's injury worsened, and the Alari healers refused to treat him, so Virea did it herself, using her own flame, a sacred rite meant only for future mates. The moment her hand touched his chest, the mark on her wrist flared with golden heat. She gasped, and Kale held her gaze, and in that instant, something ancient broke. The elders felt it. The soil of Aralith trembled. A ripple of golden light spread across the trees. The planet had sensed the moment the flame passed to a human, and the stars above whispered of a change that could not be undone. Kale recovered faster than expected. The royal flame was not meant for human blood, but he bore it well, and he changed with it. His eyes glowed faintly at night, and his strength grew in unnatural ways. The warriors whispered of prophecy, but Virea silenced them with a look. She invited him to her stargazing terrace on the 7th day. There, under the twin moons, Kale asked her why she had broken her sacred bond. She looked at the sky for a long time before answering. Because I wasn't alive before you came, she said, and in her eyes was no regret. That night, nothing physical happened, but something far deeper stirred in both of them. A new war had begun, not of weapons, but of truths, and the first truth was this: the old ways were dying, and the future would not be written in purity, but in fire. Virea woke before the sun touched the towers of Aralith. Her dreams had been strange, filled with fire, shadows, and Kale's voice. She stood at the window of her chamber, clutching the edge of her robe as if it could calm her. The mark on her wrist was still warm from the night before. It pulsed like a heart that no longer beat alone. In the garden, Kale was already awake. He was testing the movement of his arm, now fully healed. The guards stood at a distance, unsure whether to protect him or fear him. Even the plants around him seemed to lean closer, curious about the outsider. Virea watched him without speaking. She descended in silence and approached him. Kale turned and smiled. But his eyes quickly narrowed. "You look different," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Do I?" She asked with a calm voice, and in her tone, even she heard the change. He told her the invasion wasn't over. The humans attacking Aralith were from a rogue faction, disconnected from Earth. They believed the Alari's power was the key to controlling galactic portals. Kale had been against them, which is why his ship was shot down. He had fallen among enemies, but found something else instead. Varaya led him to the Temple of Echoes, a sacred place where her ancestors had once spoken with the stars. No outsider had ever entered, but she didn't care anymore. She wanted answers to the burning questions within her, and Kale followed her without hesitation. Inside, glowing stones floated in the air. They whispered softly in a language older than time. Kale paused. Feeling the energy vibrate in his chest, Varaya stepped forward and placed her hand on the central stone. It recognized her touch, then flared when Kale moved closer. The lights responded to Kale as if he were one of them. One orb circled him and shimmered, revealing a faint human silhouette. Another orb shifted into the image of Aralith burning under warships. Kale reached out but stopped himself. Varaya's breath caught in her throat. "I've never seen the stones do this," she whispered. Kale looked around with growing unease. "I think they're showing you the cost of what's coming," he said. He wasn't sure why he was connected to this place, but the temple saw something inside him that Varaya had already begun to feel. Back at the royal court, whispers grew louder. The elders feared Varaya's connection to the human. They spoke of exile, disgrace, and the fall of Ilari traditions. The nobles gathered in secret, worried that their princess had been tainted. The council demanded her presence before the sun would set. Varaya entered the chamber with her chin high. Her robe was marked with the royal flame, but she walked not as a daughter, but as a sovereign. When asked about the human, she answered without pause, "He is mine," she said clearly, and the hall went silent like never before. Kale heard the news from a servant. He knew what it meant. Even without fully understanding Alari customs, she had claimed him, not as a prisoner, but as something else. The bond they had shared in healing had turned into something sacred, and now it could not be taken back. That night, she visited his chamber. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence between them held more weight than any words. Then she placed her hand over his heart, where her flame had healed him, and in return, Kale placed his hand over her mark. Something ancient stirred, not just in them, but in the walls, the air, the stars above. The Ilari were beings of purity and power, but they had never known what it meant to truly feel in one another. They had awakened something stronger than magic, and it was not something the council could. Silence. Varaya didn't sleep that night. She stood beside Kale and watched the sky through the balcony. He stood behind her quietly, not touching, not speaking, and yet the space between them burned with unspoken energy. What had started as curiosity had now become destiny. They were no longer just Ilari and human. They were something new, something not written in the books of old. Whatever came next would test them beyond flesh and fire. But Varaya no longer feared breaking tradition, because for the first time, she knew who she truly was. The next morning, the sky over Aralith was quiet. Birds that usually sang at dawn stayed silent. Even the wind felt slower, like the world was holding its breath. Inside the palace, guards stood double shifts around Kale's quarters, and Varaya had not left her room since the night she touched him again. The royal healers had begun whispering. They said the princess had broken a 1,000-year vow. Some claimed her flame would die for what she had done. Others believed it would burn brighter than ever before. But no one could deny something powerful had awakened. Kale felt it too. He dreamed of fire underwater and stars bleeding light. When he opened his eyes, the world felt louder. He heard footsteps from halls away and sensed emotions in the air. And when Varaya entered, he knew her before she spoke. She said the council had given her a choice: either renounce the bond or leave the throne forever. Her fingers trembled as she spoke, But her voice stayed firm. Kale looked at her and knew the answer without needing to ask. She would never go back to what she was before him. Together they went to the temple again. This time the stones responded before she touched them. Light swirled around her, and Kale like a storm held in silence. They stood still, and the ancient voice of the first flame spoke for the first time in centuries. "You have done what none before dared." It said. The voice said their bond was not a mistake. It was part of a change that had been coming for generations. The Ilari bloodline had grown cold with time. Tradition had preserved them, but also kept them from living. Now life had found its way through a forbidden path. Outside, the human invaders had returned. This time they were closer, their ships entering Aralith's outer sky. The palace shields held for now, but cracks had started to show. The council demanded action, but they were divided on how to fight. Many believed only Varea's flame could protect them now. But the flame was no longer hers alone. It had passed into Kale during the healing, and through him, it had transformed. The Ilari had never shared their power with another species. Now it flowed through human veins with purpose. Kale stepped into the council chamber. Uninvited gasps followed his entrance. But he did not flinch. He spoke with the calm of someone who had nothing left to fear. "I didn't come to take your world," he said, "but I won't watch it fall when I can help save it." The council elders shouted that Kale was a danger. A flame-bearer not born of Aralith was an abomination. But Varea rose and raised her hand. The flame on her wrist blazed golden again, and when she touched Kale's shoulder, it passed between them. Like lightning, the chamber walls shook. Scrolls flew from their shelves, and every light crystal burned brighter than ever. Kale's eyes turned gold. Matching hers, the room went silent as the truth became impossible to deny. He was no longer just a human. He had become something else. Something new. The bond had changed both of them. What they were now could not be undone by law or fear, and the planet itself had accepted it. The council had no choice but to accept Kale's role. They gave him command over the outer shield defenses. Warriors who once feared him now followed him. His strategies were different, based on chaos and unpredictability, and for the first time, the Ilari began to win small battles. Varea stayed at the heart of the palace. She trained daily, preparing for the moment she might need to fight. Her strength grew each time she touched Kale's flame. Together they studied both Ilari and human war tactics, and their bond deepened, not just in spirit, but in mind. One night, as they walked through the palace gardens, Kale looked at her with more than duty in his eyes. She turned to him and spoke softly. "I don't know where this path leads," she said, "but I know I won't walk it without you." The air outside the palace thickened with tension. Human ships were no longer just observing from the sky. They had landed in the outer territories and taken ground. Fires burned in distant forests, smoke trailing like dark ribbons toward the heavens. And yet inside the palace, a different kind of fire was rising. Kale stood beside Varea in the war chamber. Maps floated around them, displaying movement of enemy units. He suggested flanking maneuvers the Ilari had never used before. His style was unpredictable and fast, something the invaders did not expect. The generals listened, though some with silent resentment. Varea watched him with sharp focus. She had led ceremonies, healed wounds, and spoken with spirits. But war was something new to her. Yet when Kale spoke, she understood things without needing the years of training her warriors had together. They moved like mind and body. The council remained cautious. Some whispered that Kale's growing influence would lead to chaos. Others feared the change in Varea's aura. She was still pure in their eyes, but they questioned how long that would last. They didn't realize it had already changed forever. In secret, the enemy had captured an Ilari scout through torture. They learned of the temple and the flame. Their leader, a ruthless human named Commander Vale, believed the flame was a weapon. He sent a strike team to breach the sacred ground. They moved through the shadows like ghosts. The temple's outer guards were overwhelmed. Silent knives, quick plasma bursts, and no mercy by the time the alarm reached. The palace, the invaders were already inside. Kale and Varaya rushed there with 2 squads behind them. But something felt wrong the moment they entered the sacred gates. The air was still too still. The floating stones inside the temple were dim. Varaya stepped forward and felt no warmth from the flame. And then from the shadows, a blade came flying toward her heart. Kale moved faster than thought. He caught the attacker mid-strike, slamming him to the ground. The rest of the strike team revealed themselves, armed and ready. But the Alari warriors fought with fire in their eyes. The battle inside the temple raged in bursts of light and sound. Varaya used her flame not to heal, but to fight. She moved like wind wrapped in fire, burning paths through her enemies. Kale fought with raw instinct, his strength beyond human. Now together, they were unstoppable. The invaders fell one by one. At the end, only Commander Vale remained. He was heavily armored and stood over the central flame. He pointed his weapon at it and smiled coldly. Kale charged first, dodging a deadly blast that melted stone. Varaya followed, her hands already glowing. Kale tackled Vale, both of them crashing to the ground. Vale was strong, but Kale was something else. He broke the weapon in 2 and drove his fist into the commander's chest. Varaya stepped forward and unleashed her flame directly into the man's core. Blast lit the entire temple. When the light faded, the room was silent. Vale's body was gone, turned to dust. The flame returned to its normal glow, steady and calm. The stones began to hum again. The temple had been defended. Outside, the remaining invaders fled, their command broken and morale shattered. Alari forces regained lost ground quickly. Kale and Varaya returned to the palace, covered in ash and light. But something between them had changed even deeper. That night, there was no ceremony, no royal robes, no ancient chants. Varaya walked alone into Kale's room. He stood at the window, watching the stars. She stepped closer and took his hand. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Their bond was no longer just energy or magic. It was choice. It was trust. It was surrender. And it was stronger than anything they had ever known. Morning came with golden clouds over Aralath. The fires from the invasion had been extinguished, but the embers inside the people still glowed. Soldiers stood straighter. Healers worked faster, and the council held their tongues. Everyone had seen what Kale and Varaya had become. Inside the palace, silence spoke louder than commands. Servants moved carefully, avoiding direct eye contact with the royal chambers. Rumors had already taken root and bloomed like wild vines. Some believed Kale had taken the princess's purity. Others said he had taken her heart. Varaya stood at the mirror brushing her silver gold hair. She saw herself not as the untouched flame-bearer anymore. She saw a woman who had chosen her path. Her fingers paused at the mark on her wrist. It was now connected to Kale in more ways than sacred texts could explain. Kale walked alone to the training field. Alari warriors watched him with both awe and fear. He lifted a staff, something he had never trained with before, but as he moved, the weapon responded like it had known him for years. He didn't fight like an Alari or a human. He moved like something in between. Varaya arrived and watched him quietly. His steps were sharp, but fluid. His eyes glowed faintly. Every time he exhaled, the flame inside him was now a part of every breath he took. The Queen Mother requested an audience. Varaya entered her chamber with Kale beside her. The old queen looked tired but sharp. She studied Kale for a long time before speaking. "You are either our blessing or our curse," she said. Kale bowed with silent respect. He said nothing, because no words could change what had already begun. The queen turned to her daughter and asked if she had chosen him fully. Varaya looked her mother in the eyes and gave her answer. "I have," she said without a tremble. There was no anger in the queen's face. Instead, she closed her eyes and nodded once. Then she handed Varaya a scroll sealed with a royal sigil. Inside were words passed down through hidden bloodlines, a prophecy too dangerous to be spoken before. The scroll told of a fire that would merge with a foreign soul, one not of Alari blood, but of iron and instinct. Together, they would awaken a new age. The old world would resist, But the bond could not be broken. The flame would either consume or transform the galaxy. Kale read it slowly and then handed it back. "I guess that's us," he said with a half-smile. Virea said nothing, only held his hand tightly. The queen gave her blessing not with words, but with silence, and that silence carried more weight than any ceremony. That evening, a vision struck Virea in her sleep. She stood on a burning bridge between two worlds. Kale stood on one side, and her people on the other. Beneath her feet, the bridge cracked, but when Kale reached for her, the fire below turned to light. She woke in sweat, gasping. The mark on her wrist glowing hot. Kale held her shoulders as she caught her breath. "I saw something," she whispered. "He didn't ask what he just said. Then we'll face it together." The war outside had paused, but a new one brewed within. The Stars scouts returned with reports of a larger fleet gathering in the void. Not just rogue humans this time, but other species who feared the bond. They had heard of the flame passing into a Terran, and fear made alliances where diplomacy had failed. The council was called into emergency session. Some demanded Virea surrender her bond. Others warned that trying to undo it could end the planet itself. But the youngest council member stood and spoke. "Maybe the bond is not the danger," she said. "Maybe our fear of change is the real enemy." No one replied, no one dared, but in that quiet chamber, something shifted, and Kale and Virea walked out knowing the path ahead would be war, but also knowing they would walk it side by side. The space above Aralith darkened as the invading fleet arrived. There were no warnings, no negotiations, only silence. Ships larger than any Aralith had seen hovered like mountains. The stars vanished behind their shadows, and everyone on the planet knew the storm had returned. Kale stood on the outer wall of the palace. Watching the sky, he could feel the flame in his chest flicker with tension. It wasn't fear, but a pressure building inside him. Virea approached without speaking. She stood beside him, her hand finding his without hesitation. Across the courtyard, soldiers lined up in formation. Alari warriors wore robes marked with symbols of the first flame. Behind them stood new defenders, trained citizens. Farmers, healers, even those who had never held a weapon stood ready. They had seen what unity could do. The council remained divided. Some believed negotiation was still possible. Others demanded full retreat into the mountain cities. But Virea stood before them and spoke with a voice steady as stone. "We fight not just for our land, but for what we've become." Kale was given command of the outer shield. He modified its pattern using human algorithms. The result was unpredictable but strong. He placed pulse cannons in new formations. His strategy was to confuse, not confront. Head on. The enemy fired first. Blue beams of heat rained down on the fields. Explosions rocked the forests and turned glass towers into rubble. The shield held, but only just. The defenders braced for a ground assault. Kale led the first line into the field. He carried no traditional weapon, only a reinforced gauntlet charged with Alari flame. Virea stayed behind to protect the core flame. She stood before the sacred altar, hands raised high. The energy flowed through her into the shield around the city. The battle was fierce. The enemy soldiers were not like Kale. They were enhanced, machine-blooded, and loyal only to conquest. Kale fought through them with blazing speed and raw strength. The flame inside him grew hotter with every strike. One soldier slammed him into the dirt, another aimed for his heart with a plasma spear. But Kale rolled and shattered the weapon with a roar. He rose again and drove his gauntlet into the earth. A shockwave of flame burst outward, sending enemies flying. The Alari warriors followed him. Inspired, their robes turned dark with ashen blood. They fought beside humans. Side by side, some fell, but none fled. For the first time in history, they fought not as two kinds but as one. Back in the temple, Virea sensed something wrong. The flame pulsed wildly. Almost out of rhythm, a shadow moved behind the altar. She turned quickly and saw a masked figure holding a blade of black light. The assassin lunged without hesitation. Virea blocked the strike with her bare hands. The flame surged into her arms. and pushed the attacker back. They fought in silence, sparks flying as metal clashed with living fire. The assassin landed a shallow cut across her side, but Varaya gritted her teeth and struck with a burst of golden light. The masked figure fell. Armor melting from the blast, Varaya dropped to one knee, her breath ragged, but she did not fall. She reached up and placed both hands on the altar, and the flame responded like a son being born. Across the battlefield, Kale felt it. His eyes burned gold, and his veins lit with heat. He looked to the sky as the shield flared stronger than ever. The enemy ships began to retreat. Unable to pierce the wall of flame, Kale raised his hand and signaled the final charge. With a united cry, the defenders pushed forward. The enemy broke formation. Their lines falling apart, Kale leapt through smoke and fire, reaching their command ship with one final strike. He brought it crashing into the ground, and when the dust cleared, only silence remained. Aralith had survived, but nothing about it was the same. Varaya stood at the temple gates, her dress torn, her side bleeding. Kale walked toward her, covered in soot and victory. They met in the middle, without a word. The sky over Aralith cleared as the last of the enemy ships vanished. The battlefield smelled of ash and scorched metal. Bodies of both enemies and allies lay scattered across the broken land. But among the ruins stood something unbroken. Kale and Varaya faced the dawn with their fingers still interlocked. Neither spoke as they walked through the wounded city. Children peeked from behind shattered walls. Mothers clutched their young as healers moved between them. Everywhere they passed, silence followed, but in that silence was respect. Kale reached out to lift a collapsed beam blocking a doorway. 3 Alari children crawled out with wide eyes and dusty faces. One of them touched his hand, and it glowed faintly in response. The flame inside him was no longer just Varaya's gift. It now belonged to the people of Aralith. Varaya spent the next day healing with her own hands. Her robes were stained with blood and dirt. She did not return to her chamber, nor did she sit on her throne. Instead, she knelt beside the injured, sharing what little strength she had left. Even the council looked upon her with new eyes. The youngest counselor approached her at dusk. He offered no speech, only a scroll with a new seal. It was a formal decree signed by all remaining elders. It recognized Kale not as an outsider, but as a bearer of the eternal flame, a protector of Aralith and future heir by bond. Kale read it slowly as the sun dipped below the horizon. He looked to Varaya, uncertain if he was ready for such a role, but she nodded softly, her gaze full of quiet certainty. "You've already earned it," she said, and her voice carried the weight of truth. That night, a gathering was held in the ruined garden. It was not a celebration, but a remembrance. Flames floated above every name spoken aloud. Each spark represented a life lost in the war, and every flame that rose into the sky lit a future. Unafraid, Varaya stepped forward to speak. She did not wear jewels or crowns, only a plain robe and the mark of the first flame. She looked at the people, Alari, human, wounded, strong, and then she looked at Kale. "We are no longer what we were before," she said. Her voice echoed through the garden. "We are what came after fire and fear, no longer divided by race or blood. We are one flame now, burning together." Cheers did not erupt. Instead, hands were raised to hearts in quiet. Unity, the gesture of the flame bearer, now shared by all, and in that moment, the scars of war began to fade, even if the pain still lived underneath. Later that night, Kale stood alone by the river. The stars above were no longer blocked by ships. They shimmered freely, reflected in the slow water. Varaya joined him without words, her steps quiet on the grass. She stood beside him and leaned into his side. "I thought I was meant to stay untouched forever," she said. "I was told it was sacred, that it was strength. But you showed me that love is strength too. That choosing to feel doesn't make me weak. It makes me alive." Kale didn't respond right away. He looked at the stars, then at her. "I didn't come here to change you," he said. "I came here because you changed me first." And in that soft moment, nothing else mattered. They walked back to the palace hand in hand. Guards bowed not just to the princess, but to the man beside her. He was no longer a stranger from another world. He was part of their story now. And the story had just begun a new chapter at the temple. The flame glowed brighter than ever. Its warmth spread across the land like a silent promise. What had begun as forbidden was now eternal, born of war, sealed by choice, and fed by courage. And the stars watched in quiet approval. Asterisk. The morning after the gathering. Aralith awoke in stillness. Birds sang again for the first time in weeks. Sunlight stretched across the palace stones like golden threads. The scent of burnt steel had faded. Replaced by blooming flowers, peace was no longer a memory, but a fragile new beginning. Kale sat in the temple courtyard with his eyes closed. He could feel the warmth of the flame from across the chamber. It no longer roared or pulsed with wild energy. Now it flowed through him like calm fire in his blood. It was not his to control, but his to protect. Varaya entered without guards or ceremony. She wore a simple robe with no markings of rank. Her hair flowed loosely behind her shoulders. She stepped beside Kale and placed a hand on his back, and in that silent contact, he felt her entire soul. The elders had offered them the throne, a new reign, where old laws would be rewritten, but Varaya declined the crown. She had no wish to rule with gold or pressure. She only wished to lead with presence. Instead, they chose to build something new, not just for Ilari or for humans, but for all who came. In peace they opened the inner sanctum to visitors from other worlds. They allowed knowledge to flow like rivers through once closed gates. And the stars began to whisper not of fear, but of hope. Some opposed this change. A few left Arelith, unwilling to accept what had been born in fire. But most stayed and adapted. They saw crops grow stronger and healers learn faster. They saw children from different bloodlines play without fear. Kale trained the new guard personally. He taught them both Earthborn tactics and Ilari techniques. They learned not just how to fight, but when not to, and those who had once feared him now called him brother. Even the elders came to respect the man they once feared. Varaya became the voice of the people. She no longer stood above them, but among them. She healed wounds with her hands and solved disputes with calm words. Her heart belonged to the people, just as it belonged to Kale, and the people followed her because they chose to. The temple flame burned brighter each season. It responded not just to royal blood, but to noble action. It tested those who stepped too close with pride, but welcomed those who stepped forward in truth. It had become more than power, it had become balance. One evening, Kale stood atop the highest tower. He watched the twin moons rise above the silver trees. Varaya joined him. Wrapping a shawl around his shoulders, she looked at him, not as the flame bearer or warrior, but simply as the man who had walked beside her since the first touch. "You changed everything," she said quietly. He smiled without turning. "No," he replied, "you changed first, and I just followed your fire." They stayed there as the night deepened. Stars moved across the sky in slow, endless dance below them. Laughter echoed from the city. Children played by glowing trees, and old warriors sang by soft fires, and above them, the stars kept watching. Varaya reached into her robe and pulled out a stone. It was the same crystal that had once hovered in the temple, but now it rested in her hand, dim but pulsing gently. She placed it in Kale's palm and curled his fingers around it. "It's yours now," she said. Kale looked down at the stone. Then at her he said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. What they had built would outlive both of them, not in monuments or statues, but in the unity of those who remained, and in the flame that no longer belonged to one kind. That night, the stars burned brighter above Aralith, not because of war or prophecy, but because two hearts had chosen each other against every law, and in doing so, had written a new law that would guide generations, not in silence, but in flame.